1965, midsummer, there was an advertisement in the local paper asking for people to join the civil defense team. And they were putting this team together primarily for the purpose of the fear from nuclear attack and assistance to civil organizations, fire, police, and so forth. Dave and I responded, and we met Carl Winter, who also responded. And we were the three remaining members of thousands of people who volunteered their time and energy to the team in the last 54 years.
When we answered that ad, we did a lot of training, but the training was not for search and rescue. And our first call out, of course, we almost killed ourselves, which prompted us to get different training. Thank God Carl Winter was there. He brought with him from Europe actual search and rescue training.
So my friend and I, we went there to the first meeting. It was down at the bottom of the Justice Building, which is now also the Public Safety Building. There was, I think it was 9 or 11 of us. My partner and I, we only had really rescue experience, but because the other ones, they were sort of fishermen and outdoors bushwhackers and what have you and so on. But we didn't get any call-outs right away. We trained vigorously every Tuesday night with civil defense.
Part of the training wasn't just the mountain training that we're known for as a team now, but it included civil defense, building extraction, collapsed buildings, nuclear warfare. I'm sorry, I wasn't really wanting to be part of that, but the reality was that it was a municipal need that was addressed. The formation of a team looked, and one of the things they saw was and where I came in was the mountain challenges. And people, whether it's the hiking end of the mountain activity or the climbing end of the mountain activity and everything in between, that was the area that North Shore Rescue became the local leader and in fact took over from what was being done, albeit not really very well, by the Mountain Rescue Group back in the 60s. And by the early 70s.
Well, when I first joined, the team was really an emergency measures team, more or less a civil defense type organization. It was the Cold War era, and they were intended to assist the RCMP and the fire department in non-firefighting public emergencies. So the traditional garb was blue coveralls and white safety helmets which fell off if you leaned forward or in high wind, and ladders and big heavy hawser-laid ropes. So not what you'd call a mobile unit for operating in the mountains.
Back in 1970 when I started, the organization was made up of a bunch of very outdoor oriented individuals who spent their recreational time doing the kind of activities that we then helped other people get out of trouble with. We hiked, we climbed, and we did it with our own equipment. And when we had a call out, you were expected to come equipped to do the job. But you had your own equipment. That was before anybody thought about some of the safety issues to make sure that we had common equipment and other things like that.
I took a lot of the guys up on a mountain for weekend trips, like Garibaldi, Black Tusk, and up the Lions and what have you. So they were familiar, but we didn't really have the equipment, especially footwork. So some of them showed up with rubber boots, you know, which is not very good out in the mountains.
Even then, it was obvious that the because of the increase in population on the North Shore and people coming to the North Shore from other areas for outdoor activities, that outdoor emergencies were going to increase, and they started to increase a lot. So obviously there was a need for a team that could operate in mountain terrain in all conditions, all weather, day or night, and have an intimate knowledge of the terrain in order to search efficiently. So the first things that really happened, the team members started to get more efficient outdoor clothing so they could survive themselves in those conditions.
We all got heavy boots and backpacks and what have you. So we did okay after a while, and so this is how we started. Eventually, we got experienced enough, and we had an old army truck with hemp ropes and generators and this sort of thing, which we didn't really need on the mountains.
We spend a lot of time learning how to tie knots and use ropes for stabilizing damaged buildings from earthquakes or other civil defense related issues. And so there was a lot of knowledge of rope techniques, but not for search and rescue, which is a different type of rope technique required. And a lot of the guys at the time that came on the team had some sort of mountaineering background, some sort of climbing background, where they would be using whatever types of ropes existed back then. But when you start extricating somebody and having to raise them up a cliff face in a stretcher and so on, that involves a whole different dynamic. That requires some understanding of what's going on with the pulley systems, the strength of the equipment you're using, the limitations of that equipment. That all had to be researched and had to be discussed with engineers. We had to do a lot of testing because the knowledge just wasn't out there. We damaged a lot of equipment in the testing in order to figure out what the limitations were. But it taught us a lot, and it helped set standards for how the team would manage any kind of a rope scenario. And to this day, a lot of that information is still very valid and is used all the time in the techniques that are deployed.
Somebody had planted the idea, don't know where it came from, we will not be searching at night. Said, well, if somebody is out there and they're injured, what are we going to do about it? Leave them there? Search is an emergency. Well, they didn't first buy that, but then we did search at night. We got headlamps and all that. The other thing was, we're going to wait 24 to 48 hours. And after that, then you'll launch a search. We said, no. The moment you get that call, you notify us. We're now under the responsibility, Provincial Emergency Program, we got a task number, that sort of thing.
The team started to do something which was really a first in search and rescue, certainly in British Columbia. They started to search at night. So rather than wait to initiate a call out early in the morning, we would go out at any time of the day or night, including the middle of the night, and lessen the chance of the victim dying before you got to him.
Some of the searches I would have been involved with early on we wouldn't have even called them searches per se, because we were actually civil defense in those first early days. We just were the only group around that would be able to go out and help anybody. But it quickly turned into a search and rescue team because people started getting more and more into the outdoors, and people were getting in trouble in the outdoors. And actually I got involved in the team because a friend of mine got killed being in the outdoors.
In 1968, a young lad and his friend were hiking in Goat Mountain North Face. He slipped and went over the edge. That's about a 1,200-foot face. And we were called to assist, carried all kinds of heavy gear in because we didn't have light gear in those days, to the edge of this cliff.
At that time, the gondola or the chairlift at the time was out for service, so we had to hike all the way up from the bottom all the way up. We just got up there when it was dark, so we tied two ropes together and we lowered one of the guys down to, which was not a good idea, but that was the only thing we could do. That we wouldn't find them. So we decided we stay up there. We made a fire and waited till the morning, till daylight, in order to see how far this person had fallen and whether he was still alive or not. So in the morning, we contacted, or the coordinator contacted 442 Squadron out of Comox, because we looked over the edge all over the place, and there's some bushes and some little trees there, and we couldn't find them. But I went into the helicopter with the Sartex and what have you from Comox, and we did find him in no time, but he was quite low down. He had probably fallen about 500-600 feet, so we knew the guy was dead. So I organized a recovery for the next day. I called some of my mountain rescue friends, which I knew I could rely on, and we brought about 6 North Shore rescue guys with us, and the helicopter dropped us off, and we put them in a body bag and lowered them down, and the North Shore rescue guys, they had a stretcher down at the valley, and when we got down, they put them in the stretcher and carried them down to where the helicopter could land, and that was our first real rescue as mountain rescue people, or North Shore rescue people, what we do now over the years.
From that beginning, we realized that we have to be trained in mountain rescue type skills. And this is where Carl's hand came in so quickly and so effectively. So Carl's training in mountaineering skills led us to many, many things, from avalanche training, survival, research by Dr. Taylor, who was by this time on the team, on hypothermia, because each search usually took hours, 6 to 8 hours, sometimes a day and a half. When you found the person, they're deeply hypothermic. At the same time, someone noticed that human tracking was a skill that the U.S. Border Patrol had. So on the phone, U.S. Border Patrol, we need some training in human tracking. Who can you offer?
Well, there was a fellow down there by the name of Joel Harden, who was using probably ancient tracking techniques, but these are tracking techniques that we had never thought of. Literally looking from step to step to step, looking for a small broken leaf, or looking for a piece of the ground where the ground had been turned over, and being able to determine how long ago might that have happened. The technology was very well developed by them, and so we started sending some of our members down to get those skills, bring them back, and train our team. The interesting thing to me is, so that's back then, and those techniques are still being taught in the same way. It's one of those things that hasn't really changed. But a good tracker is unbelievable what you can find, because sometimes all we have is a single footstep in the mud, and we know the size of their boot. If we know the kind of boot, we even know what the tread looks like. And if we can say, hey, that was this person, they went this way, it eliminates everywhere else. And then we can put our people where we need them.
All of these skills are part of the syllabus of training through the Justice Institute. And as a member of a search and rescue team in BC, you have to have passed all of these courses. So they're prerequisites. You can't just say, I'm joining the team and do my own way on my own thing.
There was only about 4 to 6 call-outs per year those early days, and so North Shore Rescue, they got some experience in those call-outs and what have you. So a lot of call-outs actually were in Lynn Canyon.
All of the team members had to intimately learn the whole North Shore terrain, which, as you know, is quite complex.
Oh yeah, I used to know every little cranny and nook. We searched, not necessarily on the trails, but on places where there could be problems for the lost person, like waterfalls and this sort of thing, you know.
You know, 3 big mountains or 3 key mountain areas that people go into. Many, many trails, canyons, cliffs, a lot of snow in the winter, and accidents, generally speaking, in that terrain would happen in bad weather. They wouldn't be known to have occurred until perhaps the middle of the night when someone wasn't reported as coming home. So they were the conditions which we had to turn out in.
Seymour was I think our main stomping ground to go out and look for people. The Suicide Gully, you know, was a big problem. People always come off the peak, and instead of going up that little hill to go onto the main trail, they kept going down and down, and the further they got down, the more difficult it gets there, you know. Now we put a trail in and also have ropes on the difficult spots, so it's not that big a deal anymore.
When I came to Canada in '67, I joined the BC Mountaineering Club and the BC Kayak and Canoe Club, and there were very, very few people, and there was a lot of stupid rivalry, and there was no attention to safety and looking after your buddy.
We're a group in Vancouver that had search and rescue experience in the mountains. We called upon them to give us a hand. And it turned out that they were individual climbers, good people, but from an organization point of view, they were not a team. And then we were getting more and more call-outs, and when we were up in the mountain, they were going their own way as opposed to communicating with us and dealing with it as an organization. So again, out of necessity, we felt that we've got to do something and create a standard. And we then created, out of necessity again, North Shore Rescue, a best practice review process. And that's now used all over Canada and some places in the United States.
We were the most experienced for the longest time, primarily because we encountered a lot more operations than almost any other team. And because we had a very diverse team of people who could pull from various, backgrounds to help understand some of the issues we were facing and how to deal with those. We passed that knowledge on in many ways, including starting the BC Search and Rescue Association, the training that went on in the Justice Institute, the programs that were developed. A lot of that first early knowledge for those programs was developed by North Shore Rescue.
In the formative days, we didn't have all the communication devices we have now. So that a call came to the police phoned the search manager they had on record as the person who had the resources available. So our job then was to communicate with the 5 squads we'd formed, 5 members in each squad, or 6 members, and then while I'm gathering my gear, my partner, my wife, Margaret, she's phoning the 5 members of the squad to verify who's there, who's available, who can respond now, who can respond in the morning.
The team itself at the time was probably the only active team until early 80s, covering all the way from Whistler to Hope. But we didn't have a lot of operations in that time necessarily. But we encountered situations that demanded that we find out how to do things better. We had to learn how to treat patients in the field, particularly for things like hypothermia, which people would be very susceptible to. Again, because the clothing and other things just weren't there in those days. We had to learn about technology, the communications side. The whole group of the guys were experimenting and working with engineers to understand rope techniques for, how to use the right kind of equipment and what were the limitations of the equipment you were using for doing rope extrication, things like this. So it was a huge learning curve on the team. Also on the side of that was the techniques for search, how to do the best search, how to manage a search really well. All of those things were a huge learning curve for the team.
At that time, the North Shore Rescue was just transitioning from having been an urban rescue team mostly involved in urban rescue, part of the old emergency measures organization. And there was another group, there was the mountain rescue group, who were high angle mountaineers, who was a fairly loose-knit group, and they were doing a little bit of rescue at the time, but there was more and more need for mountain rescue, and the North Shore Rescue was going to fill that gap. So I joined and took over much of the medical training and tried to transition the medical training from the sort of the first aid that had been going on before, which was everybody was required to have St. John's first aid certificate, which is okay on the side of a soccer field, but isn't really very applicable back in the mountains, or at least more expertise was needed. Some of the guys had industrial first aid. We had a few firemen on the team and so on. So it was a mixed group of experience. So I tried to think of first aid in the way of what was needed back in the mountains when somebody had a bad fracture or something like that, and that needed treating before they could be extricated. And we also had cases of hypothermia, because people in those days, it took a long time to get to people and get them out of the mountains. We didn't have much of the technology that we have these days. We didn't have long line helicopter rescues, and we basically went out searching in the bush, carrying a radio, and it would always be at night, and it was pouring rain. It was horrible conditions, and we'd wander around shouting every so often until somebody made contact with the lost person, and this could sometimes take several days, and then we would have to extricate them, which often meant carrying them out by stretcher, because they would be too into the forest or an inaccessible place. If there was somewhere where a helicopter could land and we could load them on, then sometimes we would have 442 Squadron or a police helicopter or something come down and pick them up. But most times, or a lot of times at least, it was a matter of carrying people out with a stretcher over several hours, and very hard work going through the bush with 6 people carrying a stretcher and spelling off. So that was basically how I got involved.
And if I have to go back roughly on the whole history of the team, we were always backfilling the need of the community and the emergency services we had then, and as they emerged and progressed in their own skill and manpower levels, we found other ways to backfill those needs, so the community was assisted by our efforts to be safe to enjoy the outdoor. There are many people who are alarmed at times about the number of calls for outdoor incidents, whatever it is. The bottom line is, on a per 100,000 user basis, that number has increased so significantly, but the number of incidents per 100,000 remained more or less static.